Hi, everyone. This is Joe Bitar, your host of the Hunting Matters podcast presented by Houston Safari Club Foundation. Thank you guys so much for joining us once again this week. Our guest this week is Pete Coppolillo, right? Pete
Coppolillo. Yep.
Coppolillo. I should have asked you that before we actually got on the air.
That's okay. That's okay.
It's Italian.
Well, it is Italian, but I'll share with you, my dad was born in Italy, and
Yep.
they say Coppolillo. My
Ah,
grandfather was born in Argentina, they say Coppolillo. So, and I grew up in Denver where everybody says Coppolillo, so you can't screw it up.
I'll stick. I'll stick with Pete.
I'll answer anything exactly. That's best.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for joining on this week's episode of Hunting Matters. The program's all about diving into various backgrounds of people who have a passion for hunting and stories about hunting, conservation, and the great outdoors. Folks, our guest today is Dr. Pete. He's the executive director for Working Dogs for Conservation. It's an organization that trains detection dogs to help protect wildlife, fight poaching, monitor endangered species, and even helps to strengthen environmental justice worldwide. Pete's background as a landscape ecologist, his work across Africa, and his love of dogs have all come together in a career that's not only inspiring, but truly making a difference. From busting wildlife traffickers to trafficking, tracking endangered species, we'll talk about the fascinating world of that Pete's living in and where conservation and canine instincts collide. So, Pete, thank you so much for joining us. Um, Before we dive into Working Dogs for Conversation, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a landscape ecologist, so my PhD was studying spatial patterns and ecological processes. That was grazing systems in East Africa. But I didn't go down the academic route. I went straight into conservation, and you know, I uh, I I think in general, as you probably know, in conservation, you end up being more of a generalist. Rather than going real deep into one thing, you bop around, and so I did. I was with an organization called the Wildlife Conservation Society, which was back in the day was New York Zoological. Back then, it was the fourth largest of the international conservation organizations. And I was there for 10 years, and just did a lot of different stuff, and some of it included working with carnivores, and back then we weren't allowed to capture or handle them. And so we started using dogs to find their scats, because this was not long after it became possible to get fecal DNA. And so, DNA from an animal's scat. And so that really just opened up our whole sort of field for this organization. And then I was in Tanzania till 2008, and then moved back to the States once my kids were 7 and 9, and it was time for them to go to a regular school. So I ran the Yellowstone program for WCS for a couple of years, and then got even more deeply involved with working dogs, because at that time, a fellow named John Beckman, who is an avid bird hunter as well, and who was working in the Centennial Mountains on grizzly bears, black bears, mountain lions, and wolves. And working on all four species at once would be sort of unheard of if you're trying to capture and collar and do all that. But and so I got real excited about it and interested in it, and kept saying, "Hey, we should do this, we should do that." And they finally said, "Well, maybe you should join our board." And then I joined the board, was on the board for a couple of years, and then and we as board members kept saying, "Hey, you guys need an executive director. You need somebody to chase money and direct traffic and do those things." And the organization was founded by four women, and they were all co-founders, and they were all smart enough not to want to be the ED. so so I put my hand up and said, "Hey, how about I move from a big global organization to a little global organization?" And that was 13 years ago, and it's been great. It's been a great run ever since.
Wow, that's a very storied past, and um, I'm sure that's just you're glossing over it. I mean, I've read your full bio. It's amazing what you've accomplished over the years. So, Working Dogs for Conversation for Conservation has a unique mission. For those people who don't know about your organization, can you explain what it is and tell us a little bit about the pillars of your organization?
Yeah, yeah. So we rescue the dogs that we train, and then we train them to be conservation dogs. And back in the day, it was just strictly detection. Now we do detection, tracking, and what we call discrimination. And all of those, those are the sort of canine techniques. But then the sort of programmatic areas that we work on, we use the dogs a lot to find and count animals. The jargony term we use for that is ecological monitoring. But just anything you need to know about them in order to help protect them. So sometimes it's just where do they live for us. We do it nowadays because genomics have gotten so good. We do a lot more actually counting animals. Genomic mark and recapture we call it. How many animals are using a certain area, for example. Um, and so we've continued to do a lot of that for 30 years now. But as the organization has evolved, we've kind of broadened our I guess you'd say our techniques, because now we're involved with well, back in the day, we were still doing a lot of ecological monitoring, and people said, "Hey, can you guys help us with invasive species?" And we said, "Sure." A dog doesn't care what if he's finding something that's invasive or native or rare or common. That they're out to play the game. So we
Right.
started working on invasive species. That program has now become we call each of these programs pillars. So the ecological monitoring is one pillar, and now we don't call it invasive species anymore. We call it biosecurity because we also work on things like diseases. But the common thread is anything that can reproduce itself, right? Because as from experience, and that we can remove a threat like a poacher or a contaminant. If we stop that from coming in, then that it's essentially over. But with biological threats like invasive species, diseases, stuff like that, there's no limit to how far they can go and continue to reproduce. So that's kind of a big deal. So we use the dogs for that. And then what I imagine we'll probably talk a lot about is wildlife crime. So
Uh,
for law enforcement, wildlife law enforcement, and we have now 62 dogs on the ground in Africa. We've been working there for about 11 years now, and just about 18 months ago, we we hired Jay Crafter, who's many uh, Africanists will know from his time. He's a Zimbabwe native, but he ran Invictus, started and ran Invictus Canine, and we brought him on and hired him because we knew that there was a lot more law enforcement coming in our near future,
uh,
both because of technology that I can tell you about a little later, and also just programmatically, we knew was a big important need. And then the last thing we do is environmental justice, which is kind of a mix of all three. It may be ecological monitoring, it could be biosecurity, it could be law enforcement, but the idea is to help communities and populations, human populations, who haven't benefited from conservation or who disproportionately pay the costs of when there's a lack of conservation, whether it's depleted wildlife or environmental degradation or anything like that. So all we try to keep them all balanced. They kind of um, some years we do more of one and less of another, but those are the big four things that we do.
Hunting Matters is presented by Copandero Indoor Archery Pistol and Rifle Range, your premier indoor archery pistol and rifle shooting destination. Located in Oak Ridge North, right next to the Woodlands, Copandero offers two 25-yard pistol ranges, a 100-yard rifle range, and a 25-yard archery range. Whether you're honing your skills or just starting, Copandero has everything you need, including rentals, classes, a retail store, an in-house cafe, and a VIP lounge. Join Copandero today for an unmatched shooting experience. To learn more, go to copandero.com. Are you guys working on any specific invasive species? Is it pretty broad, or is there a certain focus at this time?
Yeah, it is. It's always very specific. So for the most part, I well, we train the dogs to hit on their target species and not on anything else. And what they do is they give us an alert. So the dog just sits when they encounter the target odor, the target species that they've been trained on. And that could be a plant, it could be an invertebrate. We worked on emerald ash borer, and for that one, we had to train the dogs on the eggs, the larvae, and the adults. And then we had to train a separate dog on ash wood
Hmm.
because we had to identify which wood would have to be inspected for emerald ash borers. So it can get kind of complicated. But normally, what we do is we have the dogs alert to one specific species, and we train them very tightly to do that. So they're not rewarded for non-targets, um, and that's just simply because we want to well with you can't get cougar DNA from a wolf scat or vice versa or things like that. So we don't want them getting non-targets generally. There are ways you can train dogs to be more general. We just tend not to do that. We've got two dogs in Lao right now. Um, the looking for the Sao La, which hasn't been seen in the wild since 2013, was only discovered in the 90s. But it lives right on the border between Laos and Vietnam, is the remaining habitat. And but it's so rare that there's only been one individual in captivity ever, and we don't have scat samples from that individual. So we had to generalize. We had to train the dogs to do all ungulate scat. So they're hitting on muntjac and sambar and the other species that occur there, and the hope is that if they do find a Sao La scat, that they'll alert to that as well. And just so you have a picture in your mind, a Sao La it's actually a bovid, but it looks a lot like a sable.
Oh,
If I'm sure you're familiar with sable
yeah.
antelope. Looks more like that. It's a forest bovid, black and white. It's got a striking face, very beautiful, very shy animal too. Yeah.
Yeah. How long have you been working on that specific project?
Dogs have been in the field, they're coming up on 2 years now, so
Yeah.
they're in a big push. They've got, over 2,000 scat samples waiting to go through the PCR machine to tell us. So it's exciting and also kind of maddening to know that we may be sitting on, scats from the rarest mammal, probably the rarest mammal in the world, terrestrial mammal anyway. Um, but they may have also winked out. We just don't know. So that's a partnership with the Salah Foundation. That's a very close working relationship with them, and they're just a fabulous partner. And they work with the government and have a MOU with the government of Laos. And the plan is to establish protected areas wherever there may be Salah. And eventually to protect and recover that population.
So you have thousands of samples. I guess you have to geo-target or geo-plot where you find every one of those samples, and then let's say you hit on one, and you have to go, okay, this came from this place.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah, and believe me, you'll hear about it when we do.
oh yeah,
It'll be a
we'll hear
whole
the
deal.
screams.
Yeah, it'll be amazing. But then there's a pivot because all immediately we've got a sample then to train on, and then we can say to the dogs, "Okay, guys, now this is all we want you to
Yeah.
find." And you know, expert trainers, and it's funny. I'm not a dog trainer.
Uh-huh.
I don't handle. I don't train them. I just chase the money and direct traffic and do the
Right.
conservation sort of side of things with everybody. Um, but I am a bird hunter, so I have my own dogs that I shamelessly ask our staff for help with sometimes. Um, but the experienced handlers and they can help a dog transition out. Say, okay, we're not doing that anymore. Now we're doing this
Uh-huh.
because otherwise, the dogs they'll alert to their targets forever after that because they want their ball, they want their paycheck, play the game. So
What a cool that's just a cool process, and, hopefully you guys are gonna hit on something. That would be amazing, if
well,
you did.
it is, yeah, it is, and it's an incredible part of the world. I mean, it's like 20 or 30% endemism for virtually everything. So all these species that don't occur anywhere else. So it's amazing there. They have, in the course of this, looking for Sao La, have identified a lot of areas, pockets where there are lots of other species that are doing well. So that's really useful. So it'll be useful for conservation no matter what. And I'm not talking out of school or anything. It's now public
Yeah.
knowledge. The teams also discovered a new species of leaf monkey.
Really?
So you probably have a lot of Africanists in the thing, in your following. Leaf monkeys are like colobus monkeys, and they're the ones that ferment in their nuts. And so this is a big, large-bodied monkey that wasn't known to science before this. So
Wow.
it's a big deal. It's very cool. Yeah.
This is a big deal.
Capital Farm Credit understands that there's something about the outdoors that pulls you in. Could be the fresh air, the colors, the smells, the animals, the freedom. It's all just a part of who you are. And with our recreational land loans, you can purchase land for whatever outdoor pursuit you please. That way, the outdoors won't just be in your soul, it'll also be in your name. To learn more, visit capitalfarmcredit.com. Together, we're better.
big deal.
Yeah.
So I know you don't train to handle the dogs directly, but when your trainers and your staff are trying to identify potential prospects or working dogs for this program, are there certain breeds, certain physical characteristics, certain mental characteristics that you're looking for in these working dogs?
Yep, absolutely. So we, because we rescue them, we don't necessarily select for breed, although the behavioral characteristics that we do look for, they correlate with breed often. So we have a lot of labs, a lot of shepherds, Malinois, um, a lot of the working breeds. Bird dogs, we do have some. We've got a one German short hair, but a lot of them we have to be a little careful with because prey drive can be a challenge. And
Hmm.
so, one of the things I've learned about dogs through all of this is that, you don't necessarily need to train them to do everything. And particularly if they just do it instinctively, then that's even better. Except when that instinct is a distraction, like with respect to birds or too much prey drive. So we select primarily for toy drive. So if they really love their ball, they really love to tug or their ball or their frisbee or whatever, just an object. And the reason for that is because then that it never gets devalued. If we're using food rewards, there are two problems with food rewards. Out in the field is a handler would have to carry a lot of treats with them. Number
Right.
one, they could run out, and over the course of a day, the dog might find 40 or 50 targets in the day, so their hunger level would decline, and so presumably their drive to find it would as well. But and every one of you guys knows a dog like this. The ones that you make the mistake of throwing their ball for him once, and
Yep.
then it comes back and it's in your lap, and then you sit on the ball, and then he brings you a stick, and then you sit on the stick, and then he brings you a rock or a leaf or something. Just that
Yeah.
crazy desperate to interact and to play. That's one of the first things we look for. And then we do all sorts of crazy stuff with them. We take them all over the world. They have to go in helicopters or boats or small airplanes. We even had to take dogs on elephant back in Myanmar a number of years ago, because the monsoons were still going and we couldn't get a vehicle in there. And this has been planned years in advance. So in that context, we're looking for dogs that have what we call nerve strength. They can roll with whatever comes at them. Um, and that high drive and nerve strength and calmness that allows them to be calm. That's not very common. So we screen about 1,000 dogs for every one that we take. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
It sounds like just incredible animals that you guys when you find one that's gonna fit in the program, that just sounds like an incredible animal. I've got a Yorkshire Terrier that I need to send your way. He's got that mentality. He's got 3 or 4 toys around the house, and I literally, after about 45 minutes, have to take them away from him because he's so exhausted. He just didn't give it up, and so I have to hide them, but he always knows where I put them.
yeah, yeah. You've got to tell them to turn it off. They won't choose to do it on their own. Yeah,
No, no, he doesn't know. I mean, be sitting there panning and the floor will be wet because he's just like, "Well, are we gonna still play?" I'm like, You need to take a break, man."
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Working Dogs for Conservation has seen some really great growth over the past, several years. Tell me if I'm wrong, I think I got the numbers right. 32 countries, and you operate in 45 states. What's behind that growth and what's driving the demand for you guys?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a few different things. Back in the day, it was just early on, it was everybody was excited. I mean, as soon as you could, DNA, you got a little gray in your beard, so I'm sure you remember when it started to become possible, and
Yep.
we were like, "This is the right answer. This is going to tell us everything," and it wasn't quite that easy and simple, but as soon as we could find DNA from scats, then scats became incredibly valuable. So that was the early days. And then as lab costs, have come down, it's very reasonable now to get DNA. So as lab costs come down, then it opens the door for more and more, different kinds of work and different things. So, in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, it was just the novelty. Hey, let's get DNA. Let's, find it and see what animals there are and genetic diversity and all of that stuff. Then in the 2000s, it became, hey, we can do this for lots more places with lots more samples and won't break the bank, and do that. So people were coming to us because it was cost effective. That was all ecological back then, and we really resisted the law enforcement work for a long time because and this was even during my tenure as ED. I said, hey, there are security dogs all over every continent. They're in every airport. They're, let, let them do it. This is in their wheelhouse. These are the places they work. Well, one of the things I learned, this is one of the many things that I was wrong about, was law enforcement, they often don't want to put a dog on wildlife targets, because then if a drug dog hits, on cocaine or something, then a lawyer can say, well, my client had handled ivory or done whatever. So, you know, traditional law enforcement, they are very strict about what those dogs, are trained on and not. And so this was around 2010. We were doing some carnivore work in Zambia and Botswana, and our partner in Zambia from Conservation South Luangwa said, "Hey, I would love to keep doing this ecological work, but we're in a crisis here. We're having a snaring crisis. Ivory poaching is going through the roof. We need law enforcement." And so we said, okay. And we did it. And we put the first two conservation dogs went into Zambia. That was 2013 or 2014.
Mhm.
And now we're on the third generation of dogs in that program. They're still working. They're going hard. So that the last 10 years of our growth has been really driven by law enforcement. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of demand for and a lot of need for wildlife enforcement. And probably if I had to look and say about the next 10 years, I bet it would be biosecurity, because, with so much global commerce moving around, and I can tell you a little about discrimination if you're interested in hearing it, but it's discrimination allows us to work on diseases, on wildlife diseases, which is, it's very difficult to do that with traditional methods, because you got to catch them and you got to get blood and you got to do things like that. And we're able to we're starting to be able to do it non-invasively with the dogs. So that opens up, and they're very fast. So it opens up a lot of doors, and we're super grateful to the Wild Sheep Foundation, because we've worked very closely with them to manage use the dogs as a tool to manage disease, on that interface between wild and domestic sheep,
Yeah.
which you probably know quite well.
Yeah.
Hunting Matters is sponsored by Bass Pro Shops and Cabela's. Under the visionary leadership of founder Johnny Morris, Bass Pro Shops and Cabela's is leading North America's largest conservation movement. Together with their partners in conservation, they're positively shaping the future of the outdoors through donations, grant making, and advocacy. The 501c3 Outdoor Fund raises funds to support conservation efforts by activating more than 200 million passionate sportsmen and women, rounding up their purchases in Bass Pro Shops and Cabela stores and online. Visit basspro.com or cabela's.com today.
So while we're talking about the law enforcement side, anti-poaching, anti-trafficking, earlier you talked about the dogs working with problems with snares and the snare issue. What other types of work do they do in regards to anti-poaching, anti-trafficking?
Yep. So the vast majority of the anti-poaching work is with tracking dogs. So dogs that track humans. And as a human enters a protected area, particularly in Africa, it's illegal to enter on foot. And so anyone who is crossing that boundary on foot is by definition breaking the law. So up until a few years ago, it was just an exercise in driving those boundaries or patrolling the interior of a protected area. And if they saw tracks, then the dog comes out and off they go on a track. Um, and the great thing about that is that dogs are fast. They can move quietly through the bush, and in many cases they can catch somebody before they kill a rhino or an elephant or a buffalo or whatever. Um, Nowadays, though, we have these fancy AI cameras, and so the cameras can sit on a tree or anywhere. They're incredibly well camouflaged, and the guts of the camera are separate from the lens and a infrared flash. They're about as big as two fingers. And then there's a wire that goes up to the top of the tree, or you can bury it in a termite mound or wherever. And in there, it's got the guts of the camera, but it also has a satellite phone. And so when it takes a picture, if it takes a picture of a baboon, it just records it to the card, just like a regular camera trap or trail cam or whatever. But when it sees a human in that image, then that image gets transmitted to the anti-poaching team. The anti-poaching team says, "We somebody just walked in," and they scramble the dog team, and off they go. And it's incredibly powerful. and super effective. So that's part of the reason we hired Jay. And I'll just as an aside, Jay's a fabulous character. You should have him on. He's got way better stories than me, and also a very deep perspective because he grew up in Zimbabwe. He's seen a long change, and it's near and dear to his heart because his grandfather helped set up Konareju National Park, and then his uncle was a Selous scout there, and then he went and put the first canine unit in there. So it's all very hits very close to home for him. But so that's a lot of what we do is we train the dogs to do that and respond very quickly. And that's and it's a complicated process to get them, tracking well. Some people say, a dog teaching a dog to track is like teaching a fish to swim. They do it naturally, and that's really true. But we don't want them to just swim, right? We want them to do a very specific thing and find that one specific person that they've done. So that takes a lot of discipline. But then the other side of it too is Jay trains what he calls a proximity alert, and and um, I think of it, it's not exactly right, but I think of it because I'm a bird hunter and because my dogs, I know when they're following ground scent and when they transition to air scent, that's when I know, okay, we're close to birds right now, right? Well, Jay trains the dogs to do the same thing with their human quarry. And often what happens when they get close like that, the dog stops, gives a proximity alert, and then the cover team, who's armed, can come in and make an arrest.
Mm,
Well, twice in the last year, that proximity alert has saved rangers because poachers have set up for an ambush,
mm,
and so the dog knew they were there and stopped and then gave the proximity alert, and they were able to make the arrest where otherwise they might have walked into it just blind. So it's pretty high stakes, the the training and the level of sort of performance. Um, and so that tracking is most of it, but there's also smuggling. So dogs will inspect vehicles going into a park for ammunition or guns or anything unauthorized like that. They may they may get them on the way out, and they can look for anything: bushmeat, ivory, rhino horn, illegal timber. In this country, there's a lot of ginseng that gets trafficked. So they can work on all of those. So that's regular detection, just like you would a drug dog or anything like that. And then the last little piece is very small. We don't do a ton of it, but we do have a pilot going right now. It's another discrimination problem, which is um, which is we can take air, we can suck air out of containers. As you probably know, a lot of wildlife gets trafficked in containers,
uh-huh.
and global commerce moves in containers, and not very many of them are searched for customs, right? Um, Inspected. And so what we can do is, even though there's a customs seal on there, that's the door of that container is sealed, we can evacuate air from inside, pass it through a filter. The air from inside the container goes through a filter, and then we present those filters to the dogs. And if there's ivory in the container or shark fin or whatever the dog's target odor is, the dog will alert to that. And so it's a technique called RASCO, remote air sampling for canine olfaction. But what it does is it allows us to quickly sample a lot of containers without having to open them, because as you might imagine, you open it and there's a wall of stuff, and you've got to pull it out to inspect. It would take hours and hours, but a dog can tell us if there's something in there, very quickly. So that's really helpful. We have a pilot going right now in South Africa. It's actually with the South African Customs Department, working on illegal fish with Rasco.
Hunting Matters is presented by DEA Ranch. Are you looking for the ultimate South Texas hunting experience? Then look no further than DEA Ranch. DEA Ranch offers some of the best whitetail and exotic game hunts in South Texas year round. Whether you're looking to fill your freezer or put that next hunting memory on the wall, their professional guides are focused on ensuring each client has a memorable and exciting hunting experience. DEA Ranch offers guided hunts, professional staff, chef prepared meals, trophy preparation, and more. To learn more, go to dearanch.com. That's dearanch.com.
Wow. Yeah, no, I had no idea that the technology you guys are using had advanced so much. And that's obviously that one approach or that one technique saves you a lot of time and money and effort
Absolutely.
to be able to screen those bags. Are you finding, we used to hear the stories, well, we got a bunch of poachers and they had a gun from the 40s or something with them, a single shot, 410, whatever. I think that's changed now. Are you finding that the prowess and the technologies being used by traffickers and poachers has exponentially increased over the past few years? And if so, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it absolutely has. It absolutely has. I mean, I live here in Montana, and whenever there's an arrest and a seizure, um, as soon as they're allowed, the guys send pictures and stuff like that. And I'll tell you, these guns that a lot of the guys, particularly in Namibia right now, are using to poach rhino, are any hunter walking around the hills here in Montana would be proud to carry one of these rifles. They're fancy.
Mhm.
They have big scopes. A lot of them have suppressors on them, and we had an incident. We're asked to respond to an incident, the teams, where they in one night killed 4 rhinos at a water hole. Headshots, dropped them right where they were. So
Wow.
these are not unsophisticated. These guys know how to shoot. They know what they're doing, and that's really where we are right now, is going from I I don't wanna say it in a disparaging way because I mean, it's super important and back in the day, like when I was living in Africa, I've been back in the States for 17 years now, 18 years now. Um, it was patrolling was you drive them out to the bush, you drop them off and they walk back, or you drive the boundary and, it was very, it was simple.
Mhm.
And poaching has gotten a lot more sophisticated. And so one of the things that Jay is doing with all of our teams now, and I say our teams, they actually work for either host country governments or other NGOs. They're not our employees, but they're our dogs that we put with them, so we consider them all part of the family. But so what Jay's doing with them is he's taking from his military training. He was trained with the British military and British Army, U.S. military as a mine detection dog and patrol dog trainer. And now what he's training the game scouts on the ground in is our counterterrorism methods because the poachers have gotten so sophisticated. So they'll do things like there'll be nothing for a month, not a single incursion, and then all of a sudden, 4 incursions from 4 different areas in one night. So they're doing coordinated attacks
Mm.
and how to respond to those without getting without leaving big parts of the protected area uncovered or anything is part of what Jay trains everybody in, and so and it's been incredibly effective. He did a training last year in north central Namibia, and in the management area, the unit where they did the training, um, up until that time, and in an adjacent management unit, they had been just the rhinos were getting hammered. They were losing a lot of rhino. They almost doubled the number of rhino killed last year from 2023 to 2024. And it's largely Chinese syndicates that got onto it and have moved in. And in this particular area, he trained everybody in how to use the counterterrorism methods and everything, and completely shut down poaching during the month-long intervention where they were training everybody because they train in the field and in the incidents I mentioned with the proximity alerts with the dogs, those actually happen during training. And when they encounter real footprints, then training's over and it's a live operation. And so during that time, they shut down poaching in that management unit, and it hasn't come back. They caught the guys who perhaps it was their territory. We don't know, but and so maybe nobody's recolonized these guys' sort of territory, or maybe word's out that hey, they're tough over there. So, and then interestingly, I probably shouldn't mention what the technique was, but there is a technique that the poachers were using to mask their movements in the bush.
Huh?
And Jay, spent his whole life in Africa, and focused just on anti-poaching for the last 13 years or so. He said he'd never seen this. Interestingly, after that exercise, we have just heard the last couple of months that in Kruger National Park, all the way across the continent, I mean, all the way on the other side, in South Africa, they're now seeing poachers doing the same thing.
Huh.
So I think we're dealing with a scale and a level of sophistication that I certainly haven't seen before. And I think it's people don't at that level. I mean, there are people who poach because they want to, meat or they want to be in the bush or do whatever. At this level of trafficking, these guys, they don't have a vendetta against rhino. They're just doing it because that's the most valuable thing around. And
Yeah.
these are the same people. They'll pivot to drugs or guns or human trafficking as well. So I think that's part of it. It's now in the industry. These are pros. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they're chasing the dollar. Um, it stirred some memories in me. A couple of years ago, I was in Namibia hunting, and every time someone shot, the trackers or the PHs had to call in to the base camp, on radio, say, "Okay, we're out in this area. We shot 3 times. This is what we took." And if you didn't, they would send a anti-poaching patrol out. I mean, they would be on the ground almost instantly. Of course, this particular place had a rhino conservancy on it. They didn't hunt them, of course, but, that was heavily guarded, and, you hear these stories or see these documentaries and things that it's gotten to the point now, even when they move them, they do it under the cover of darkness, under armed guards and 18-wheelers that nobody can supposedly nobody knows about, and it's just it's just it's fascinating, and it's amazing, and it's sad all at the same time that, you have to go to those measures to protect animals, and I know people are may come across this podcast, go, "Well, you're a hunter. What are you talking about protecting animals?" Well, I mean, we're preaching to the choir here between the 2 of us, but, I mean, we all know that the funding and the efforts and all those things that go into anti-poaching and anti-trafficking, a large scale portion of them are backed by hunters. And it's like, we've had this conversation many times on this podcast before. When animals become a commodity and don't have a value, then they become just that, a valueless commodity. And you can't sink dollars and time and effort into programs like Working Dogs for Conservation to support these efforts. Um, when you guys work with local rangers or law enforcement, how does that relationship begin? Do they reach out to you? Do you reach out to them? How do you pair dogs with them? I'm curious about what the startup looks like.
Yeah. Well, I'll encourage you to get the full story from Jay when he comes on because it is one of the I knew Jay for 10 years before we hired him, and one of the things that he's exceptional at is handler selection, and he takes a lot from his military background. So he'll just do all sorts of interesting stuff that he'll have them walk with a spoon and an egg, and then it'll say, walk down this trail through, you got to step through tires and do things like that. And he said, I'll leave numbers along the side of the trail. He just tells them that there'll be numbers along the side of the trail. So they go, okay. And then, everybody's expecting what number did you see? And he'll say, what color was it? What color was it written in? Or what color was the paper it was on? Or things like that, just who's paying attention to detail. And then interestingly, late in the process, they have a time when everybody comes in and they bring the dogs in and the candidates are in and everything. And Jay says at those points, it's the dogs who are selecting the people at that point, who's just got a rapport and who's who's comfortable, because I always tell people, just because these dogs are talented doesn't mean they're well behaved. Right. I mean, think NBA players or something like that, right?
We raised 3 boys. I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, sometimes they'll climb all over you, or they can be difficult to handle or anything like that. So having the guys who are real comfortable around them and and just there's a natural self-selection that kind of goes on. And in fact, we often take people that have no dog experience because, you know, in this country and in Africa, you get a lot of old school heavy-handed kind of old training techniques. And a lot of working dogs in Africa were just security dogs that were just made to be mean, right? And so we don't want any of that, and we don't do bite work. We don't any of that side of things. So it really takes somebody who's going to think outside the box and take direction on new sort of things, and right down to the voice guys use for their rewards. We were working in Zambia, and the guys would say, good dog," like this, in a low, kind of rumbly voice, and then saying, "Well, sometimes if you use a happy voice and a higher pitch, the dogs respond to that a little more." So then the guy started saying, happy, happy, happy when they were alerting, which was awesome. And you can see the dogs respond, but it's somebody, that's a personality type who's just gonna, who just says, I'm gonna, I'm gonna do what it takes. I don't care if I look dumb or feel dumb or do whatever. And I'm gonna help, work on this dog and meet him where he is. That's a particular kind of person.
Nobody wants to imagine an emergency on a hunting trip, but when the unexpected happens, you want the team of medical and security experts at Global Rescue to be there for you. Global Rescue Operations Centers are staffed by experienced personnel, and you'll always speak to an expert on the first call. Global Rescue provides unparalleled capabilities to transport members to the hospital of their choice, not just the closest. So trade what ifs for peace of mind with convenient travel services designed for the unexpected. Learn more at globalrescue.com/hunting matters.
Yeah, yeah, I can see where yeah, you're changing approaches and techniques and whole mindsets too when you're putting these dogs on the ground. In this realm of poaching and trafficking, obviously corruption's a big thing, safety issues, danger, not only for the handlers but for the dogs themselves are big issues. How do you guys work with these local law enforcement groups to I mean, obviously, you've taken a lot of time and money to train these dogs, and the dogs are, and the people are both are part of a valuable team. So, is there advisement you guys give these guys, or is there things you guys work with these people on to address any issues, or maybe from a preventative standpoint?
Honestly, selective. We're pretty selective about who we work with.
Hmm.
We there are places and contexts, particularly in Africa, where we've been asked to go, where we just said, not touching it, no way, and that's just because of corruption, because of the same. So, for example, if we've got dogs screening vehicles or containers, one of the first questions I ask of the partners on the ground is, who chooses which ones get searched, right? Can I just walk up and go, that one? We're going to search that one today, and we're going to do that one tomorrow, and whatever. And they say, "Oh, no, no, we'll bring them. We'll tell you which ones. We'll bring those to you." Well, I'm not gonna spend thousands and thousands of dollars training dogs for window dressing to make it look like somebody's doing law enforcement, right? And so having them look at a curated set of vehicles or containers or whatever, and never finding anything, or occasionally finding one thing and having a big celebration, we're just not interested in that.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunate, but we do say no a lot. Um, but also there's a lot and some of the work that Jay's doing right now in Namibia is also about operational security. Like, who needs to know what, right? So with the cameras, for example, we know the locations of those AI cameras, right? But we don't disclose them. And even if there's an alert, it may only be the driver and the unit leader, unit commander, who knows actually which camera they're going to respond to. And that's not because we don't trust the dog as the handlers, but if there's somebody else who's associated with that, a mechanic, the kid who swept out the vehicles, somebody who helped him load, whatever, where you guys going? What's happening? That kind of thing. So it really tightens up the whole situation. And the dog unit, dogs they're not magic, and they're not as effective when they're isolated.
Mhm.
So, this integration, having the canine unit, it's an opportunity to talk about intelligence, movements, operational security, all those procedures, all the really important stuff that isn't canine, it isn't technically driven, but it's absolutely essential. And so that's part of the reason those units, they do so well, is because they get that sort of advanced training. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure you guys definitely have to screen who you're working with, and yeah, unfortunately, sometimes you have to say no because, like you said, it's
Yep.
a lot of it's the unfortunate truth that a lot of these operations, they're almost facades. You don't want to go and put these animals in a situation where they're not valued and protected.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
talked a little bit. You talked a little bit earlier about ecological monitoring. Do you guys finding and counting species? Do you guys use your dogs for that purpose as well? And how does that help with the overall conservation movement in this country and in the world?
Yeah, we do. And it's still a big part of what we do. Um, and it varies. It depends. In a lot of cases, so for example, we've got dogs in Arizona right now, working on black-footed ferrets. Um, you know, rarest. land mammal in North America right now, but a big conservation success story. I mean, they've been reintroduced in so many places, and it was so interesting. As a colleague from the Nature Conservancy, they did a reintroduction down in Colorado, and he told this really moving story about how his daughter came out and they had the little cat carrier, and they got the ferret bred in captivity, and then they go over to the prairie dog and they open the little carrier and the ferret goes down, and he said that was 4 years ago and we haven't seen a ferret since. Like, that ferret population, they're doing fine, they just don't come above ground. So, but how do we know? And they do, and they treat for bubonic plague, and they spend a lot of money and time trying to protect those ferrets, but how do you know if it's working? So we bring the dogs in and they're able to get counts and both map where they are, so the dogs will smell down the burrows and say there's a ferret in there or there's not. And so they can do that. And just are these interventions working? That's one example of it. I mean, and of course, the most basic foundation for management is knowing how many animals you've got. How many can you take if you don't know how many you've got? So that we do a lot of that now too.
So one of the projects we talked about, that we talked about a lot of stuff in Africa, but in the U.S., you guys, you and I talked a little bit. You guys are doing a project with black-footed ferrets. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So ferrets have been reintroduced. Well, they're all throughout their what is now their range. I think it might be up to like 30 sites or something like that. And those are big investments. And so, the state agencies that are and the feds who are managing them want to know if the things that they're doing are beneficial. And so, in order to do that, they have to count them. But ferrets spend all their time underground,
Mm.
so we use the dogs to sniff prairie dog burrows and tell us if there are ferrets in them, and that allows them to get a count and to look at their spatial distribution and develop a trend. He's getting louder. I'm gonna move him. I'm sorry.
You
Should I
should
move him?
you shouldn't have acknowledged. No, he's fine.
Okay,
You
okay.
shouldn't have acknowledged him,
I
and
know, I
he
know, yeah,
knows you're talking about him.
exactly right, yeah, yeah.
Um, you sent me some information over before we did the podcast to look at, and you've got a philosophy that the right number of bird dogs is always one more than you have, right?
Yeah.
So you have a couple bird dogs, right?
I have 2 right now.
Birch and Enzo?
The old man is not here yet. Birch is the old man, he's 12 and a half,
Yeah.
and Enzo, he's a puppy, he just turned 1.
Ah,
So, yeah, and, it's a great I love bird hunting and I love being around the dogs. The only reason I'm able to do it is 'cause, is because, most of it is genetic for them. My job is stay out of their way and let them do their jobs and figure it out, but it's great. It's great fun to get to do that with them.
yeah. It's you you said, like you said, you're the guy who's raising the money, moving all that sort of thing. But I'm sure you've been in the field and have heard stories in the field. Can you share with me one of the craziest, or funny, or crazy, or just bizarre stories that you guys have encountered in the field working with detection dogs?
Man, it's usually I mean, I'll tell you, one of the things I didn't appreciate before I started this job was the extent to which a working dog can just create total chaos around.
Yep.
Because they're so driven, because they're so focused, and because they're so, committed to whatever it is that's got their attention at that moment. Um, and so, yeah, we have a lot of moments like that. I mean, often the crazy everything falls apart moments are when you're moving dogs or on the way to a field site or whatever. Once they get in their job and they're doing their thing, then they're like ninjas. They're laser focused and super professional. But it's when they're waiting to do their jobs or things like that when the chaos happens.
Yeah.
So our staff, they've got stories from all over the world of times you think they're going to behave and they bust out. Um, we had a dog throw a collar on the tarmac, with an active runway. right next to it one time. He had been in a crate. He came all the way from the States. This was in Africa, and and he said, "Finally, I'm here. I'm free." And then and he he busted out of his big flat collar, and fortunately, they're working dogs and they're psyched about their toys. So all you need is their toy, and he's right back, right back to you and right back in. But it was a heart stopping moment.
Are you looking for an investment that goes beyond the ordinary? Wildlife Partners is the nation's leader in breeding and consulting for the exotic wildlife industry. When you invest in wildlife, you're not just acquiring a 100% tax deductible asset, you're playing a vital role in the conservation of endangered species. Do you own land? You can turn your ranch into a profitable wildlife driven business. And even if you don't own land, that's no problem. Wildlife Partners offers unique opportunities for non landowners to invest in conservation while enjoying significant tax benefits and potential cash flow. Yeah, sure. I'm sure. Um, Pete, when you you live in this world, people say be careful. So it's great that you can do what you love, but be careful because sometimes you see the dirty underbelly, if you will, of this of the world in which you work in. Uh, you see a lot of bad things, you hear about a lot of bad things, but you also see a lot of great things as well as success stories. What today gives you hope for the future of hunting and conservation?
You know, I've always been very optimistic about conservation generally, but specifically the role of hunting in conservation. The very first time I was ever in Africa, this was back in the '90s. A colleague said he had just come back from reviewing a bunch of hunting operations in Tanzania, and I lived in Tanzania, did my PhD there, worked there for 14 years, and I love Tanzania. It's a wonderful place. But back then, there was a lot of corruption in the conservation and in the hunting world and all of that. And he came back and he said, the average photographic tourist is spending $55 a day, and the average hunter is spending over $1,000 a day.
Mm.
Here's the big kicker. And then years later, actually, he'd be another great one to have on your show, Rolf Baldus. He ran the Salou program for GTZ, the German development organization, and he said yes, that's true. Hunters spend more money, and he said, and the density of visitors is 44 times higher for photographic tourism and versus hunting tourism. So I mean, 44 times. That's more vehicles, more washing, more firewood, I mean, all of those different things. And so from way back since the '90s, I've thought, that's a hugely powerful thing. And as I've started to hunt myself, and as I've gotten to know other hunters in particular, you know, I guess there are some people who do it halfway a little bit, but you don't. There are just very few things that tap into that um, something deep within us, And so when people really hunt and they're dedicated to hunting, they're incredibly dedicated, and that's hugely powerful for conservation because I mean, from the safari club side, I'm sure people who've spent their life savings and other people's life savings hauling back and forth to Africa or Asia or here in the States or wherever and plowing that money into conservation. And that's, I think about that a lot here in Montana where more people hunt than not. And, you know, we've got you see deer in the middle of town. You see, there's wildlife everywhere. And you've spent enough time in Africa to know that there are a lot of parts of Africa where if you're not in a protected area, you're not seeing wildlife. And
Mm.
so helping us get to that point, turn that corner for Africa and Asia, I think there's there it is really hopeful. And every large carnivore is increasing in Europe right now. That's amazing. It's Europe. It's packed, loaded with people. The fact that we still have tigers in India is incredible. I mean, so many people. So we can do this. We can do this, and there are plenty of resources and plenty of dedication. It's just a matter of connecting the dots and getting it all done. And maybe that's cockeyed optimism that keeps me, from from doing this work and beating our heads against the wall, doing the work. But I think it's genuine and it's true. And as particularly, Africa's near and dear to my heart. Um, and I've spent a lot of my career thinking about it and everything. And I think helping as Africa develops and gets, a more solid rule of law, corruption comes under control, and the rest of Africa is going to be a lot more like Namibia, in the future, where you've got great roads and solid institutions and things like that, and I think all those things are hopeful.
Yeah.
I think that they're trending. It's not a smooth trend. We go up and down a lot, but it is trending in the right direction.
Yeah. No, that's a great perspective. I appreciate that. So how can our listeners and viewers help Working Dogs for Conservation?
Oh, well, that's nice of you to ask. Thank you for asking that. We're a nonprofit, so we're funded with donations, and quite honestly, it's donations from individuals that are the most valuable for us. And the reason for that is because it's unrestricted. We can do whatever is most important with it. You get a government grant or a foundation grant. A lot of the times, you got to stick to the plan of what was proposed. And if you thought you were going to spend $5,000 on fuel and you only spent three, then sometimes it's difficult to use that other two for something else. But with individual gifts, we're able to just, when the Sal Law Foundation came to us and said, we're going to have a 2-year push to find the Sal Law, I said, we're in. We didn't need to go write grants. We didn't need to go chase money. We just said, that's the most important conservation thing happening for us this year. Let's do it. And
Yeah.
that's wonderful. So people, logging on and donating is wonderful. Um, there are a lot of people now who screen dogs for us around the country. So we get FEMA and search and rescue, and those people, they see dogs, let us know about them. Because, like I said, we screen 1,000 dogs for every one that we take. So learning about, hey, there's a great candidate, and military, police, everybody who know about working dogs, when they have a candidate dog who might wash out, we get military dogs who don't like to bite, right?
Mm.
We don't do bite work. We don't care. That's fine. It's wonderful. So, those people knowing it and pick up the phone and call us and say, hey, there's a great dog here, is always a big help as well. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. So folks, get involved. Check out their website at WD4, the number 4C. That's Working Dogs for Conservation. That's WD, the number 4C.org. Dr. Pete Coppolillo.
Dr. Pete's fine.
I've got Italian relatives. I should know this. Uh, Dr.
It's funny.
Pete.
You go to Italy, nobody bounces over it at all. They
Yeah,
just say it.
yeah,
It's funny.
exactly. Dr. Pete Coppolillo, the executive director of Working Dogs for Conservation. Pete, this has been one of my favorite episodes. Thank you so much for sharing this story and what the great works you guys are doing. So
Well,
really, really appreciate your time.
thank you for everything you're doing, and giving back, and for having us on and telling our story. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks everyone for listening to this week's episode of Hunting Matters, brought to you by Houston Safari Club Foundation.
The Houston Safari Club Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that supports the future of hunting and conservation. Wildlife and habitat conservation, youth education and outdoor experiences, scholarships, and anti-poaching efforts are just a few of the programs supported by this organization. Monthly events, an annual convention, award-winning publications, networking opportunities, and valuable resources for hunting knowledge are just a few of the benefits of being a member of Houston Safari Club Foundation. If you're searching for a group of people dedicated to protecting the future of hunting, look no further. Join Houston Safari Club Foundation today at wehuntwegive.org or call 713-623-8844.
Hunting Matters is a Houston Safari Club Foundation production. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For questions or more information, email us at info@wehuntwegive.org.